Anyway, welcome to Paper Cuts. Last we left off, our intrepid invisible anti-hero? Our intrepid invisible protagonist, let's say. He got himself into quite a bit of trouble, and now he's on the run. And, he convinced a random Joe Schmo that, since he's invisible, he can grant the Joe Schmo a great deal of boons. And that's essentially where we left off. After our invisible protagonist guy, he essentially flipped out and ow! I just bruised the heck out of my finger. He essentially flipped out and destroyed his secret of being invisible. Now a lot of people know, and now he's on the run. As I was saying before I so rudely interrupted myself, let's just get right into chapter 10, Mr. Marvel's visit to Iping. After the first gusty panic had spent itself, Iping had become argumentative. Skepticism suddenly reared its head. Rather nervous skepticism, not at all assured of its back, but skepticism nevertheless. It's so much easier not to believe in an invisible man, and those who had actually seen him dissolve into air or felt the strength of his arm could be counted on the fingers of two hands. And of these witnesses, Mr. Wadgers was presently missing, having retired impregnably behind the bolts and bars of his own house, and Jaffers was lying, stunned, in the parlor of the Coach and Horses. Great and strange ideas transcending experience often have less effect upon men and women than smaller, more tangible considerations. Iping was, well, hang on, I got a word. Iping was all aflutter with bunting, and everyone was in gala dress. Whit Monday had been looked forward to for a month or more, and by the afternoon even those who believed in the unseen were beginning to resume their little amusements in a tentative fashion, on the supposition that he had gone away, and with the skeptics he was already a jest. But people, skeptics, and believers alike were remarkably all sociable that day. Hazeman's Meadow was alive with a tent in which Miss Bunting and other ladies were preparing tea, while without the Sunday school children ran races and played games under the noisy guidance of the curate and the Misses Cuss and Sackbut. No doubt there was a slight uneasiness in the air, but people for the most part had the sense to conceal whatever imaginative qualms they experienced. On the village green an inclined strong rope, down which, clinging the while to a pulley-swing handle, one could be hurled violently against a sack at the other end, came in for considerable favor among the adolescents, as also did the swings and coconut shies. There was also promenading, and the steam organ attached to a small roundabout filled the air with a pungent flavor of oil and with equally pungent music. Members of the club, who had attended church in the morning, were splendid in badges of pink and green, and some of the happier-minded had also adorned their bowler hats with brilliant-colored flavors of ribbon. Old Fletcher, whose conceptions of holiday-making were severe, was visible through the jasmine about his window, or through the open door, whichever way you chose to look, and he was poised delicately on a plank supported on two chairs, and whitewashing the ceiling of his front room. About 4 o'clock a stranger entered the village from the direction of the downs. He was a short, stout person, in an extraordinarily shabby top hat, and he appeared to be very much out of breath. His cheeks were alternately limp and tightly puffed, and his mottled face was apprehensive, and he moved with a sort of reluctant alacrity. He turned the corner of the church and directed his way to the Coach and Horses. Among others, old Fletcher remembers seeing him, and indeed the old gentleman was so struck by his peculiar agitation that he inadvertently allowed a quantity of whitewash to run down the brush into the sleeve of his coat while regarding him. This stranger, to the perceptions of the proprietor of the coconut shy, appeared to be speaking to himself, and Mr. Huckster remarked the same thing. He stopped at the foot of the coach and horse's steps, and according to Mr. Huckster, appeared to go a severe internal struggle before he could induce himself to enter the house. Finally he marched up the steps, and was seen by Mr. Huckster to turn to the left and open the door of the parlor. Mr. Huckster heard voices from within the room and from the bar apprising the man of his error. "That room's private," said Hall, and the stranger shut the door clumsily and went into the bar. In the course of a few minutes he reappeared, wiping his lips with the back of his hand, with an air of quiet satisfaction that somehow impressed Mr. Huckster as assumed. He stood looking about him for some moments, and then Mr. Huckster saw him walk in an oddly furtive manner toward the gates of the yard, upon which the parlor window opened. The stranger, after some hesitation, leant against one of the gate-posts, produced a short clay pipe, and prepared to fill it. His hands and fingers trembled while doing so, and he lit it clumsily, and folding his arms, began to smoke in a languid attitude, an attitude which his occasional glances up the yard altogether belied. All this Mr. Huckster saw over the canisters of the tobacco window, and the singularity of the man's behavior prompted him to maintain his observation. Presently the stranger stood up abruptly and put his pipe in his pocket, and then he vanished into the yard. Forthwith Mr. Huckster, conceiving he was witness of some petty larceny, leapt round his counter and ran out into the road to intercept the thief. And as he did so, Mr. Marvel reappeared, his hat askew, a big bundle in a blue tablecloth in one hand, and 3 books tied together, as it proved afterwards with the vicar's braces, in the other. Directly as he saw Huckster, he gave a sort of gasp, and turned sharply to the left, and began to run. "Stop, thief!" cried Huckster, and set off after him. Mr. Huckster's sensations were vivid, but brief. He saw the man just before him, and spurted briskly for the church corner and the hill road. He saw the village flags and festivities beyond, and a face or two turned towards him. He bawled, "Stop!" again, but he had hardly gone 10 strides before his shin was caught in some mysterious fashion, and he was no longer running, but flying with inconceivable rapidity through the air. He saw the ground suddenly close to his face, and the world seemed to splash into a million whirling specks of light, and subsequent proceedings interested him no more. Chapter 11. In the Coach and Horses. Now, in order clearly to understand what had happened in the inn, it is necessary to go back to the moment when Mr. Marvel first came into view of Mr. Huckster's window. Excuse me. At that precise moment, Mr. Cuss and Mr. Bunting were in the parlor. They were seriously investigating the strange occurrences of the morning, and were, with Mr. Hall's permission, making a thorough examination of the invisible man's belongings. Jaffers had partially recovered from his fall, and had gone home in the charge of his sympathetic friends. The stranger's scattered garments had been removed by Miss Hall, and the room tidied up. And on the table under the window where the stranger had been wont to work, Cuss had been hit almost at once on 3 big books and a manuscript labeled Diary. "Diary?" said Cuss, putting the 3 books on the table. "Now, at any rate, we shall learn something." The vicar stood with his hands on the table. "Diary," repeated Cuss, sitting down and putting 2 volumes to support the 3rd, opened it. No name on the flyleaf. Bother, a cipher. Figures." The vicar came round to look over his shoulder, and Cuss turned the pages over with a face suddenly burning disappointed. "Dear me, it's all cipher, Bunting." "There are no diagrams? No illustrations throwing light?" said Mr. Bunting. "See for yourself. Some of it's mathematical, some of it's Russian, or some such language, to judge by the letters. Some of it's Greek. Now, the Greek, I thought you—" "Oh, of course," said Mr. Bunting, taking out and wiping his spectacles, and feeling suddenly very uncomfortable, for he had no Greek left in his mind, at least worth talking about. "Yes, the Greek, of course, may furnish a clue." "I'll find you a place." "I'd rather glance through the volumes first. The general impression first, cuss, and then, we can go looking for clues. That guy had like 4 voices there. He coughed, put on his glasses, arranged them fastidiously, coughed again, and wished something would happen to avert the seemingly inevitable exposure. And then he took the volume Cuss handed him in a leisurely manner. Then something happened. The door opened, rather suddenly. Both gentlemen started violently, looked round, and were relieved to see a sporadically rosy face beneath a furry silk hat. Tap? Asked the face, and stood staring. No. No, over on that other side, my man. And please shut that door. All right, said the intruder, as it seemed, in a low voice, curiously different from the huskiness of the first inquiry. Right you are, said the intruder in his former voice. Stand clear. And he vanished and closed the door. A sailor, I should judge. Amusing fellows they are, stand clear indeed. A nautical term referring to his getting back out of the room, I suppose. I dare say so. My nerves are all loose today. It made me jump, the door opening like that. Mr. Bunting smiled as if he hadn't jumped as well. And now these books. Something sniffed as he did so. One thing is indisputable. There certainly have been very strange things happening in Iping during the last few days. Very strange. I cannot, of course, believe in this absurd invisibility story. It's incredible. Simply incredible, but the fact remains that I certainly saw, right down his sleeve. But did you? Are you sure? Suppose a mirror, for instance. Hallucinations are so easily produced. I don't know if you've ever seen a really good conjurer. I won't argue again. We've thrashed that out, Bunting. And now there's these books. Here's some of what I take to be Greek. There's certainly some Greek letters, at least. He pointed to the middle of the page, and Mr. Bunting flushed slightly and brought his face nearer, apparently finding some difficulty with his glasses. And suddenly he became aware of a strange feeling at the nape of his neck. He tried to raise his head and encountered an immovable resistance. The feeling was a curious pressure, the grip of a heavy, firm hand, and it bore his chin irresistibly to the table. Don't move, little man, or I'll brain you both, whispered a voice. He looked into the face of Cuss close to his own, and each saw a horrified reaction of his own sickly astonishment. I'm sorry to handle you so roughly, but it's unavoidable. Since when did you learn to pry into an investigator's private memoranda? Said the voice, and 2 chins struck the table simultaneously, and 2 sets of teeth rattled. Since when did you learn to invade the private rooms of a man in misfortune? And the concussion was repeated. Where have they put my clothes? Listen. The windows are fastened, and I've taken the key out of the door. I'm a fairly strong man, and I have the poker handy, besides being invisible. There's not the slightest doubt I could, kill you both and get away quite easily if I wanted to. Do you understand? Very well. If I let you go, you will promise not to try any nonsense, and to do what I tell you? The vicar and the doctor looked at one another, and the doctor pulled a face. Yes, said Mr. Bunting, and the doctor repeated it. Then the pressure on their necks relaxed, and the doctor and vicar sat up, both very red in the face and wriggling their heads. Please, keep sitting where you are. Here's the poker, you see. When I came into this room, continued the invisible man, after presenting the poker to the tip of the nose of each of his visitors, I didn't expect to find it occupied. I expected to find, in addition to my books of memoranda, an outfit of clothing. Where is it? No. Don't rise. I can see it's gone. Now, just at present, though the days are quite warm enough for an invisible man to run about stark, the evenings are quite chilly. I want clothing and other accommodation. I also must have those 3 books, you see. Chapter 12. The Invisible Man Loses His Temper. It's unavoidable at this point that the narrative should break off again, for a certain very painful reason that will be presently apparent. While these things were going on in the parlor, and while Mr. Huckster was watching Mr. Marvel smoking his pipe against the gate, not a half-dozen yards away were Mr. Hall and Teddy Henfrey, discussing in a state of cloudy puzzlement, the one Iping topic. Suddenly there came a violent thud against the door of the parlor, a sharp cry, and then silence. "Hello? Hello?" Teddy Henfrey first said, and then, I'm just gonna redo those hellos and actually say the says where they go. "Hello?" said Teddy Henfrey. "Hello?" came from the tap. Mr. Hall took in things slowly but surely. "Now that ain't right," he said, came round from behind the bar toward the parlor door. He and Teddy approached the door together with intent faces and their eyes considered. "There's something wrong," said Hall, and Henfrey nodded agreement. Whiffs of an unpleasant chemical odor met them, and there was a muffled sound of conversation, very rapid and subdued. "You all right there?" said Hall, rapping at the door. The muttered conversation ceased abruptly. For a moment there was silence, and then conversation was resumed in hissing whispers and a sharp cry of "No, no you don't." Then came a sudden motion and the oversetting of a chair, as though there was a brief struggle, and then silence again. What's going on?" exclaimed Henfrey, sotto voce. "Are you all right in there?" said Mr. Hall, sharply again. The vicar's voice answered with a curious jerking intonation. "Quite right. Please don't interrupt." How odd. How odd. He says he don't interrupt, and I heard him. And a sniff. They remained listening, and their conversation was rapid and subdued. "I can't," said Mr. Bunting, his voice rising. "I tell you, sir, I will not." "What was that?" asked Henfrey. "Says you weren't speaking to us, was he?" "Disgraceful," said Bunting within. "Disgraceful," said Henfrey. "I heard it distinct. But who's that speaking now?" "Mr. Cuss, I suppose. Can you hear anything?" Silence, and the sounds within were indistinct and perplexing. "It sounds like they're throwing the tablecloth about." Miss Hall appeared behind the bar, and Hall made gestures of silence and invitation. This aroused Miss Hall's wifely opposition. "What are you listening to there for, Hall? Ain't you nothing better to do a busy day like this?" Hall tried to convey everything by grimaces and dumb show, but Miss Hall was obdurate. She raised her voice, and so Hall and Henfrey, rather crestfallen, tiptoed back to the bar, gesticulating to explain to her. At first she refused to see anything in what they had heard at all, and then she insisted on Hall keeping silence while Henfrey told her his story. She was inclined to think that the whole business nonsense. Perhaps they were just moving the furniture about. "I heard him say disgraceful, that I did." "I heard that too, Miss Hall." "Like his lord." Wow, I really don't have a voice for Miss Hall anymore. "Hush, didn't I hear the window?" "What window?" "The parlor window." Everyone stood listening intently, and Miss Hall's eyes, directed straight before her, saw, without seeing, the brilliant oblong of the inn door, the road white and vivid, and Huckster's shop front blistering in the June sun. Abruptly, Huckster's door opened, and Huckster appeared, eyes staring with excitement, arms gesticulating. "Yep, stop, thief!" And he ran obliquely across the oblong toward the yard gates and vanished. Simultaneously there came a tumult from the parlor, and the sound of a window being closed. Hall, Henfrey, and the human contents of the tap rushed out at once, pell-mell, into the street. They saw someone whisk around the corner towards the road, and Mr. Huckster executed a complicated leap in the air that ended on his face and shoulder. Down the street, people were standing, astonished, or running toward them. Mr. Huckster was stunned, and Henfrey stopped to discover this, but Hall and 2 laborers from the tap rushed at once to the corner, shouting incoherent things, and saw Mr. Marvel vanishing by the corner of the church wall. They appear to have jumped to the impossible conclusion that this was the Invisible Man suddenly become visible, and set off at once along the lane in pursuit. But Hall had hardly run a dozen yards before he gave a loud shout of astonishment and went flying headlong, sideways, clutching at one of the laborers and bringing him to the ground. He'd been charged just as one charges a man during football. The second laborer came round in a circle, stared, and, conceiving that Hall had tumbled over his own accord, returned to resume the pursuit, only to be tripped by the ankle, just as Huckster had been. Then, as the first laborer struggled to his feet, he was kicked sideways by a blow that might have felled an ox. As he went down, the rush from the direction of the village green came round the corner. The first to appear was the proprietor of the Coconut Shy, a burly man in a blue jersey. He was astonished to see the lane empty, save for 3 men sprawling absurdly on the ground. And then something happened to his rearmost foot, and he went headlong and rolled sideways, just in time to graze the feet of his brother and partner. Following headlong, the 2 were then kicked, knelt on, fallen over, and cursed by quite a number of over-hasty people. Now when Hall and Henfrey and the laborers ran out of the house, Miss Hall, who had been disciplined by years of experience, remained in the bar next to the till. And suddenly the parlor door opened, and Mr. Cuss appeared, and without glancing at her, rushed at once down the steps toward the corner. "Hold him!" he cried. "Don't let him drop that parcel." He knew nothing of the existence of Marvel, for the Invisible Man had handed over the books and bundle in the yard. The face of Mr. Cuss was angry and resolute, but his costume was defective, a sort of limp white kilt that only could have passed muster and grease. "Hold him, he's got my trousers and every stitch of the vicar's clothes." Tend to him in a minute," he cried to Henfrey as he passed the prostrate Huckster, and coming round the corner to join the tumult, was promptly knocked off his feet and into an indecorous sprawl. Somebody in full flight trod heavily on his finger, and he yelped, struggling to regain his feet, was knocked against and thrown on all fours again, and became aware that he was involved not in a capture, but a rout. Everyone was running back to the village, and so he rose again and was hit severely behind the ear. He staggered and set off back to the coach and horses forthwith, leaping over the deserted huckster, who was now sitting up in his way. Behind him, as he was halfway up the inn steps, he heard a sudden yell of rage, rising sharply out of the confusion of cries, and a sounding smack in someone's face. He recognized the voice as that of the Invisible Man, and the note was that of a man suddenly infuriated by a painful blow. In another moment, Cuss was back in the parlor. "He's coming back, Bunting. Save yourself." Mr. Bunting was standing in the window, engaged in an attempt to clothe himself in the hearthrug and a West Surrey Gazette. "Who's coming?" he said, so startled that his costume narrowly escaped disintegration. "The Invisible Man," said Cuss, and rushed onto the window. "We'd better clear out from here. He's fighting mad. Mad!" In another moment he was out in the yard. "Good heavens!" said Mr. Bunting, hesitating between 2 horrible alternatives. He heard a frightful struggle in the passage of the inn, and his decision was made. He clambered out of the window, adjusted his costume hastily, and fled up the village as fast as his fat little legs would carry him. From the moment when the Invisible Man screamed with rage, and Mr. Bunting made his memorable flight up the village, it became impossible to give a consecutive account of affairs in Iping. Possibly the Invisible Man's original intention was simply to cover Marvel's retreat with the clothes and books, but his temper, at no time very good, seems to have gone completely at some chance blow, and forthwith he set to smiting and overthrowing for the mere satisfaction of it. You must figure the street full of running figures, of doors slamming and fights for hiding places. You gotta figure the tumult suddenly striking on the unstable equilibrium of old Fletcher's planks and 2 chairs with cataclysmic results. Consider an appalled couple caught dismally in a swing, and then the whole tumultuous rush is past, and the Iping street with its gauds and flags is deserted, save for the still raging unseen and littered with coconuts, overthrown canvas screens, and the scattered stock and trade of a sweetstuff stall. Everywhere there's a sound of closing shutters and shoving bolts, and the only visible humanity is an occasional flitting eye under a raised eyebrow in the corner of a window pane. The Invisible Man amused himself for a little while by breaking all the windows in the Coach and Horses, and then he thrust a street lamp through the parlor window of Miss Gribble. He it must have been who cut the telegraph wire to Adderdean just beyond Higgins' cottage on the Adderdean road. And after that, as his peculiar qualities allowed, he passed out of human perceptions altogether, and he was neither heard, seen, nor felt in Iping any more. He had vanished absolutely. But it was the best part of 2 hours before any human being ventured out again into the desolation of the Iping street. Chapter 13. Mr. Marvel discusses his resignation. When the dusk was gathering and Iping was just beginning to peep timorously forth again upon the shattered wreckage of its bank holiday, a short, thick-set man in a shabby silk hat was marching painfully through the twilight behind the beechwoods on the road to Bramblehurst. He carried 3 books bound together by some sort of ornamental elastic ligature, and a bundle wrapped in blue tablecloth. His rubicund face expressed consternation and fatigue. He appeared to be in a spasmodic sort of hurry. He was accompanied by a voice other than his own, and ever and again he winced under the touch of unseen hands. "If you give me the slip again, if you attempt to give me the slip again." "Lord, that shoulder's a mass of bruises as it is." "On my honor, I will strike you down." "I didn't try to give you the slip," said Marvel in a voice that was not far remote from tears. "I swear I didn't. I didn't know the blessed turning, that was all. How the devil was I to know the blessed turning? As it is, I've been knocked about." "You'll get knocked about a great deal more if you don't mind," said the voice, and Mr. Marvel abruptly became silent. He puffed out his cheeks, and his eyes were eloquent of despair. "It's bad enough to let these floundering yokels explode my little secret without your cutting off my books. It's lucky for some of them they cut and ran when they did. Here I am, no one knew I was invisible, and now what am I to do?" "What am I to do?" asked Marvel sotto voce. "It's all about. It'll be in the papers. Everybody be looking for me, everyone on their guard." The voice broke off into vivid curses and ceased, and the despair of Mr. Marvel's face deepened and his pace slackened. "Go on." Mr. Marvel's face assumed a grayish tint between the ruddier patches. "Don't drop those books, stupid," said the voice, sharply overtaking him. "The fact is, I shall have to make use of you. You're a poor tool, but I must." "I'm a miserable tool." "You are." "I'm the worst possible tool you could have." "I'm not strong. I'm not over-strong." "No." "And my heart's weak. That little business, I pulled it through, of course, but bless you, I could have dropped." "Well?" "I haven't the nerve and strength for the sort of thing you want." "I'll stimulate you." "I wish you wouldn't. I wouldn't like to mess up your plans, you know, but I might out of sheer funk and misery." "You'd better not," said the voice with quiet emphasis. "Oh, I wish I was done for. It ain't justice, you must admit. It seems to me I've got a perfect right—" "Get on with it," said the voice, and Mr. Marvel once again mended his pace, and for a time they went in silence again. "It's devilish hard." This was quite ineffectual, and he tried another tack. "What do I make by it?" he began again, in a tone of unendurable wrong. "Oh, shut up," said the voice with sudden amazing vigor. "I'll see to you all right. You do what you're told, you'll do it all right. You're a fool and all that, but you'll do." "I tell you, sir, I'm not the man for it. Respectfully, but it is so." "If you don't shut up, I shall twist your wrist again. I want to think." Presently 2 oblongs of yellow light appeared through the trees, and the square tower of a church loomed through the gloaming. "I shall keep my hand on your shoulder all through the village. Go straight through and try no foolery. It'll be the worst for you if you do." "I know that, I know all that." The unhappy-looking figure in the obsolete silk hat passed up the street of the little village with his burdens, and passed into the gathering darkness beyond the lights of the windows. Chapter 14. At Port Stowe. 10 o'clock the next morning found Mr. Marvel unshaven, dirty, and travel-stained, sitting with the books beside him, and his hands deep in his pockets, looking very weary and nervous and uncomfortable, and inflating his cheeks at infrequent intervals, on the bench outside a little inn on the outskirts of Port Stowe. Beside him were the books, but now they were tied with string. The bundle had been abandoned in the pine woods beyond Bramblehurst, in accordance with the change in the plans of the Invisible Man. Mr. Marvel sat on the bench, and although no one took the slightest notice of him, his agitation remained at a fever heat. His hands would go ever and ever again to his various pockets with a curious nervous fumbling. When he had been sitting for the better part of an hour, however, an elderly mariner, carrying a newspaper, came out of the inn and sat down beside him. "Pleasant day," said the mariner, and Mr. Marvel glanced about him with something very like terror. "Very." "Just seasonable weather for this time of year," said the mariner, taking no denial. "Quite." The mariner produced a toothpick, and, saving his regard, was engrossed nearby for some minutes. His eyes, meanwhile, were at liberty to examine Mr. Marvel's dusty figure and the books beside him. As he had approached, Mr. Marvel had heard a sound like the dropping of coins into a pocket, and he was struck by the contrast of Mr. Marvel's appearance with this suggestion of opulence. Thence his mind wandered back again to a topic that had taken a curiously firm hold on his imagination. "Books?" he said suddenly, noisily finishing with the toothpick. Well..." Mr. Marvel started and looked at them. Yes, they are books." "There's some extraordinary things in books." "I believe you." "And some extraordinary things out of them." "True likewise." He eyed his interlocutor, and then glanced about him. "There's some extraordinary things in newspapers, for example." "There are." "In this newspaper." "Oh," said Mr. Marvel. "There's a story," said the mariner, fixing Mr. Marvel with an eye that was firm and deliberate. "There's a story about an invisible man, for instance." Mr. Marvel pulled his mouth askew and scratched his cheek, and felt his ears glowing. "What will they be writing next? Austria or America?" "Neither. Here." "Good heavens!" "When I say here," said the mariner, to Mr. Marvel's intense relief, "I don't, of course, mean here in this place. I mean, well, hereabouts." "An invisible man? What's he been up to?" "Everything," said the mariner, controlling Marvel with his eye, and then amplifying. "Every blessed thing." "I haven't seen a paper in these 4 days." "I brings the place he started at." "Indeed." "He started there, and where he came from nobody don't seem to know. Here it is, peculiar story from Iping. Says here in this paper the evidence is extraordinary strong. Extraordinary." "Good heavens!" "But then it's an extraordinary story. There's a clergyman and a medical gent witnesses. Saw him all right and proper, or leastways didn't see him, I suppose. He was staying, as it says, at the Coach and Horses, and nobody don't seem to have been aware of his misfortune. It says, until an altercation in the inn, it says bandages on his inn were torn off. Then they observed his head was invisible. They attempted once to secure him, but we cast off his garments and succeeded in escaping, it says.
Not until after a desperate struggle in which he inflicted serious injuries on our worthy and able constable, Mr. J.A. Jeffers. It's a pretty straight story, huh? Names and everything.
Good heavens, said Mr. Marvel, looking nervously about him, trying to count the money in his pockets by his unaided sense of touch, and full of a strange and novel idea. It sounds most astonishing.
Don't it? Extraordinary, I call it. Never heard of invisible men before, I haven't, but nowadays, here's such a lot of extraordinary things that, well, you see.
Does that all you get? Asked Marvel, trying to seem at ease.
It's enough, isn't it?
You didn't go back by any chance? Just escaped, and that's all, huh?
Oh, why, it ain't enough.
Quite enough.
I should think it's enough. I should think it's enough, though.
He didn't have any pals? It didn't say any pals, does it?
Ain't one of a sort enough for you? No, thank heaven, as one might say, he didn't.
And he nodded his head slowly.
It makes me regular uncomfortable, the bare thought of that chap running about the country. For he's at present at large, and from certain evidence, it's supposed that he's, well, took, I suppose they mean, the road to Port Stowe. You see, we're right in it. None of your American wonders this time. And just think of the things he might do where you'd be if he took a drop over and above and had a fancy to go for you. Suppose he wants to rob, who can prevent him? He can trespass, he can burgle, walk through a cordon of policemen as easy as you or me could give the slip to a blind man. Easier. For these here blind chaps here uncommon sharp, I'm told. Wherever there was liquor he fancied, well, I see. Well,
he's got a tremendous advantage, certainly, and, well...
You're right, he has.
All this time, Mr. Marvel had been glancing about him intently, listening for faint footfalls, trying to detect some imperceptible movements. He seemed on the point of some great resolution, and coughed behind his hand. And he looked about him again, listened, and bent towards the mariner, and lowered his voice. The fact of it is, I happen to know just a thing or two about this invisible man from private sources.
Oh, you do now?
Yes, me. I do.
Indeed, can I ask any?
You'll be astonished, it's tremendous.
Well, do tell.
The fact is, began Mr. Marvel, eagerly in a confidential undertone, and suddenly his expression changed marvelously. Ow! He rose stiffly in the seat, and his face was eloquent of physical suffering. Wow!
What's up?
Toothache, said Mr. Marvel, and put his hand to his ear. He caught hold of his books. I must be getting on, I think. And he edged in a curious way along the seat away from the interlocutor. But you was just gonna tell
me about this here invisible man,
protested the mariner, and Mr. Marvel seemed to consult with himself.
Hoax! It's a hoax!
Said the voice, and then echoed Mr. Marvel.
But it's here in the paper.
Hoax all the same. I know the chap that started the lie. There ain't no invisible man whatsoever, blimey.
But how's about this paper, do you mean to say?
Not a word of it. The mariner stared, paper in hand, and Mr. Marvel jerkily faced about.
Wait a minute, you mean to say?
I do.
Then why'd you let me go out and tell you all this blasted stuff, then? What do you mean by letting a man make a fool of himself like that for, eh?
Mr. Marvel blew out his cheeks, and the mariner was suddenly very red indeed.
I've been talking here this 10 minutes, and you little pot-bellied, leathery-faced son of an old boot, couldn't have the elementary manners.
Don't you come bandying words with me.
Bandying words? I'm in a jolly good mind.
Oh, come up, said a voice, and Mr. Marvel was suddenly whirled about and started marching off in a curious spasmodic manner.
You'd better move on,
said the mariner. Who's moving on? Said Marvel. He was receding obliquely with a curious hurrying gait, and the occasional jerks forward. Some way along the road he began a muttered monologue, protests and recriminations.
"Silly devil,"
said the mariner, with legs wide apart and elbows akimbo, watching the receding figure.
"I'll show you, you goober. Hoaxing me, it's right here in the paper."
Mr. Marvel retorted incoherently, and receding was hidden by a bend in the road, but the mariner still stood magnificent in the midst of the way, until the approach of a butcher's cart dislodged him. Then he turned himself toward Port Stowe.
"Full of extraordinary folks. Just to take me down a bit, that was his silly game. It's on the paper."
And there was another extraordinary thing he was presently to hear that had happened quite close to him, and that was a vision of a fistful of money, no less, travelling without visible agency along by the wall at the corner of St. Michael's Lane. A brother mariner had seen this wonderful sight and that very morning, and snatched at the money forthwith, and been knocked headlong, and when he'd gotten to his feet the butterfly money had vanished. Our mariner was in the mood to believe anything, he declared, but that was a bit too stiff. Afterwards, however, he began to think things over. The story of the flying money was true, after all, and all about the neighbourhood, even from the august London and Country Banking Company, from the tills of shops and inns, doors standing out sunny weather entirely open. Money had been quietly and dexterously making off that day in handfuls and rouleaux, floating quietly along by walls and shady places, dodging quickly from the approaching eyes of men. And it had, though no man had traced it, inevitably ended its mysterious flight in the pocket of that agitated gentleman in the obsolete silk hat, sitting outside the little inn on the outskirts of Port Stowe. It was 10 days after, and indeed only when the Burdock story was already old, that the mariner collated these facts and began to understand how near he had been to the wonderful invisible man. Just a second. Ooh, sorry about that, people listening to the recording. I accidentally the whole thing there for a moment. But let's get into chapter 15. The Man Who Was A-Running. In the early evening time, Dr. Kemp was sitting in his study in the Belvedere, on the hill overlooking Burdock. It was a pleasant little room with 3 windows, to the north, the west, and the south, and publications absolutely covered with books and scientific publications, and a broad writing table, and under the north window a microscope, glass slips, minute instruments, some cultures, and scattered bottles of reagents. Dr. Kemp's solar lamp was lit, albeit the sky was still bright with the sunset light, and his blinds were up because there was no offense of peering outsiders to require them pulled down. Dr. Kemp was a tall and slender young man with flaxen hair and a mustache almost white, and the work he was upon would earn him, well, he hoped anyway, the fellowship of the Royal Society, so highly did he think of it. And his eye, presently wandering from his work, caught the sunset blazing at the back of the hill that's over his own. For a minute, perhaps, he sat, pen in mouth, admiring the rich golden color above the crest, and then his attention was attracted by the little figure of a man, inky black, running over the hill brow towards him. He was a shortish little man, and he wore a very high hat, and well, he was running so fast that his legs verily twinkled. "Another of those fools, like that one who ran into me this morning round a corner with the invisible man coming, sir. I can't imagine what possesses people. One might think we were in the 13th century, for crying out loud." He got up, went to the window, and stared at the dusky hillside, and the dark little figure tearing down it. "He seems in a confounded hurry," said Dr. Kemp, "but he doesn't seem to be getting on. If his pockets were full of lead, he couldn't run heavier." In another moment, the higher of the villas that had climbed up the hill from Burdock had occulted the running figure, and he was visible again for a moment, again, and then again, 3 times between the 3 detached houses that came next, and the terrace hid him. people, said Dr. Kemp, swinging round on his heel and walking back to his writing table. But those who saw the fugitive nearer and perceived the abject terror on his perspiring face, being themselves in the open roadway, didn't share in the doctor's contempt. By the man pounded, and as he ran, he chinked the wall. He clinked, rather. By the man pounded, and as he ran, he clinked like a well-filled purse that's tossed to and fro. He looked neither to the right or to the left, but where his dilated eyes stared straight downhill, to where the lamps were being lit and the people were crowded in the street, and on his ill-shaped mouth fell apart, and a glary foam lay on his lips, and his breath became hoarse and noisy. All he passed stopped up and began staring up the road and down, and interrogating one another, with an inkling of discomfort for the reason of his haste. And then presently, far up the hill, a dog playing in the road yelped and ran under a gate, and as they still wandered, something like a wind, a pad, 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 sounding like panting breathing, rushed by. People screamed, people sprang off the pavement and passed in shouts and passed by instinct down the hill. They were shouting in the street before Marvel was halfway there, and they were bolting into houses and slamming the door behind them with the news. He heard it and made one last desperate spurt. Fear came striding by, rushed ahead of him, and in a moment he'd seize the town.
We must be coming. We must be mad.
Chapter 16. In the Jolly Cricketers. The Jolly Cricketers is just at the bottom of the hill where the tram lines begin. The barman leant his fat red arms on the counter and talked of horses with an anemic cabman, while the black-bearded man in the grey snapped-up biscuit and cheese drank Burton and conversed in American with a policeman off duty. "What's that shouting about?" said the anemic cabman, going off at a tangent, trying to see up the hill over the dirty yellow blind in the low window of the inn, and somebody ran by outside.
Fire, perhaps?
Said the barman. Footsteps approached, running heavily, and the door was thrown open violently, and Marvel, weeping and dishevelled, his hat gone, the neck of his coat torn open, rushed in, made a convulsive turn, and attempted to shut the door, but it was held half open by a strap.
"Oh, Crummy!"
he bawled, his voice shrieking with terror.
"He's coming! Mr. Man, after me! For heaven's sake, help me! Help!
"Shut the doors. Who's coming? What's the row?" said the policeman. And he went to the door, released the strap, and it slammed. The American closed the other door.
"Let me go inside,"
said Marvel, staggering and weeping, but still clutching the books.
"Let me go inside. Lock me in somewhere. I tell you, he's after me. I gave him a slip. He said he'd kill me and he will."
"You're safe," said the man with the black beard. "The door's shut. What's it all about?"
"Let me go inside,"
said Marvel, and he shrieked aloud as a blow suddenly made the fastened door shiver, and was followed by a hurried rapping and a shouting outside. "Hello, who's there?" said the policeman, and Mr. Marvel began to make frantic dives at panels that looked like doors.
"He'll kill me. He's got a knife or something, for heaven's sake."
"Here you are, come in here," said the barman, and he held up the flap of the bar. Mr. Marvel rushed behind the bar as the summons outside was repeated.
"Don't open the door," he screamed. "Please don't open the door. Where should I hide?"
"This the invisible man, then?" asked the man with the black beard with one hand behind him. "I guess it's about time we saw him." The window of the inn was suddenly smashed in, and there was a screaming and running to and fro in the street. The policeman had been standing on the settee, staring out, craning to see who was at the door, and he got down with raised eyebrows. "What's that?" he said, and the barman stood in front of the bar parlor door, which was now locked on Mr. Marvel, stared at the smashed window, and came round to the two other men. Everything was suddenly quiet, and "Oh, I wish I had my truncheon," said the policeman, going irresolutely to the door. "Once we open and he comes, there's no stopping him." "Not you being too much for him on that door," said the anemic cabman anxiously.
Draw the bolts, and if he comes...
The man with the black beard showed a revolver in his hand.
That won't do. That's murder. I know what country I'm in,
said the man with the beard.
I'm gonna let off on his legs.
Draw the bolts.
Not with that blinking thing going off behind me,
said the barman, craning over the blind.
Very well,
said the man with the beard, and stooping down, revolver ready, drew them himself. Barman, cabman, and policeman faced about.
Come in,
said the bearded man in an undertone, standing back and facing the unbolted doors with his pistol behind him. No one came in. The door remained closed. 5 minutes afterwards, when a second cabman pushed his head in cautiously, they were still waiting, and an anxious face peered out of the bar parlor and supplied information.
All the doors of the house shut. He's going round his prowling around. He's as artful as the devil. Good heavens, there's the back. Just watch them doors, I say, said the barman.
And he looked about him helplessly. The bar parlor door slammed, and they heard the key turn.
There's the yard door and the private door. The yard door.
He rushed out of the bar. In a minute he reappeared with a carving knife in his hand.
The yard door was opened,
he said, and his fat underlip dropped.
He may be in the house now, said the cabman. He's not in the kitchen,
said the barman.
There's 2 women there, and I've stabbed every inch of it with this little beef slicer. They don't think he's come in. They haven't noticed.
Have you fastened it?
We're out of frocks.
The man with the beard had replaced his revolver, and even as he did so, the flap of the bar was shut down and the bolt clicked. And then with a tremendous thud, the catch of the door snapped, and the bar parlor door burst open. They heard Marvel squeal like a caught leveret, and forthwith they were clambering over the bar to his rescue. The bearded man's revolver cracked, and the looking-glass at the back of the parlor starred and came smashing and tinkling down. You do? As the barman entered the room, he saw Marvel, curiously crumpled up and struggling against the door that led to the yard and the kitchen. The door flew open while the barman hesitated, and Marvel was dragged into the kitchen. There was a scream and a clatter of pans. Marvel, head down and lugging back obstinately, was forced to the kitchen door, and the bolts were drawn. Then the policeman who had been trying to pass the barman rushed in, followed by one of the cabmen, gripped the wrist of the invisible hand that collared Marvel, but was hit in the face and went reeling back. The door opened, and Marvel made a frantic effort to contain the lodgment behind it, and then the cabman collared something.
You got him!
The barman's red hands came clawing at the unseen.
Here he is!
Mr. Marvel, released, suddenly dropped to the ground and made an attempt to crawl behind the legs of the fighting men. The struggle blundered round the edge of the door, and the voice of the invisible man was heard for the first time, yelling out sharply as the policeman trod on his foot. Then he cried out passionately, and his fists flew round like flails. The cabman suddenly whooped and doubled up, kicked up under the diaphragm, and the door into the bar parlor from the kitchen slammed and covered Mr. Marvel's retreat. The men in the kitchen found themselves clutching at and struggling with empty air.
"Where's he gone?"
said the man with the beard.
"Out?" "This way,"
said the policeman, stepping into the yard and stopping. A piece of tile whizzed by his head and smashed among the crockery on the kitchen table.
"I'll show him,"
shouted the man with the black beard, and suddenly a steel barrel shone over the policeman's shoulder, and 5 bullets had followed one another, into the twilight whence the missile had come. As he fired, the man with the beard moved his hand in a horizontal curve, so that his shots radiated out into the narrow yard like spokes from a wheel.
5 cartridges,
said the man with the black beard, breaking the silence.
"That's the best of all. 4 aces and a joker. Get a lantern, someone. Come feel bad for his body."
Chapter 17. Chapter 17. Dr. Kemp's Visitor. Dr. Kemp had continued writing in his study until the shots roused him. Crack, crack, crack. They came one after the other. said Dr. Kemp, putting his pen into his mouth again and listening. "Who's letting off revolvers in Burdock? What are they up to now?" He went to the south window and threw it up, leaning out, and he stared down on the network of windows, beaded gas lamps and shops, with black interstices of roof and yard that made up the town at night. Looks like a crowd down the hill by the cricketers. And he remained watching. Thence his eyes wandered over the town to far away, where the ship's lights shone, and the pier glowed, a little illuminated, faceted pavilion, like a gem of yellow light. The moon in its first quarter hung over the westward hill, and the stars were clear and almost tropically bright. After 5 minutes, during which his mind had travelled into a remote speculation of social conditions of the future, and lost itself at last over the time dimension, Dr. Kemp roused himself with a sigh, pulled down the window again, and returned to his writing desk. It must have been about an hour after this that the front doorbell rang. He'd been writing slackly and with intervals of abstraction since the shots. He sat listening and heard the servant answer the door, and waited for her feet on the staircase, but she didn't come.
Wonder what that was,
said Dr. Kemp. He tried to resume his work, failed, got up and went downstairs from his study to the landing, rang and called over the balustrade to the housemaid as she appeared in the hall below.
"Was that a letter?"
he asked.
"Only a runaway ring, sir."
I'm restless tonight," he said to himself, and went back to his studies, this time attacking his work resolutely. In a little while he was hard at work again, and the only sounds in the room were the ticking of the clock, and the subdued shrillness of his quill, hurrying in the very circle of light his lampshade threw on his table. Hang on, I have ticking. You should probably be able to hear that watch clicking. It's a little quiet, and I think it's actually slowing. It might need a new battery, actually. I don't know, I've had it since since I went to Europe, so it probably needs a new battery, honestly. Wouldn't shock me. It's not too far behind time, though. It looks to be about 8:30 on this watch. So, Anyway, I digress. I got a little distracted. It was 2:00 before Kemp had finished his work for the night, and he rose, yawned, and went downstairs to bed. He already removed his coat and vest when he noticed he was thirsty. He took a candle and went down to the dining room in search of a siphon and whiskey. Dr. Kemp's scientific pursuits made him a very observant man, and as he crossed the hall, he noticed a dark spot on the linoleum near the mat at the foot of the stairs. He went on upstairs, and, then it suddenly occurred to him to ask himself what the spot on the linoleum might be. Apparently some subconscious element was at work. At any rate, he returned with his burden, went back down the hall, and put down the siphon and whiskey, and bending down touched the spot. Without any great surprise, he found it had the stickiness and color of drying blood. He took up his burden again and returned upstairs, looking about him and trying to account for the blood spot. On the landing he saw something and stopped astonished. The door handle of his own room was blood-stained. He looked at his own hand. It was quite clean. Then he remembered that the door of his room had been open when he come down from his study, and that consequently he hadn't touched the handle at all. He went straight into his room, his face quite calm, perhaps a trifle more resolute than usual. His glance, wandering inquisitively, fell on the bed, and on the counterpane was a mess of blood. The sheet had been torn. He hadn't noticed this before because he'd walked straight to the dressing table. On the further side the bedclothes were depressed as if someone had been recently sitting there. Then he had an odd impression that he heard a low voice say, "Good heavens, Kemp?" But Dr. Kemp was no believer in hearing voices. He stood staring at the tumbled sheets. Was that really a voice? He looked about again, but noticed nothing further than the disordered and blood-stained bed. Then distinctly he heard a movement across the room, near that wash-hand stand. All men, however highly educated, retain some superstitious inklings. The feeling that's called eerie came upon him, and he closed the door of the room, came forward to the dressing table, and put down his burdens. Suddenly, with a start, he perceived a coiled and blood-stained bandage of linen rag hanging in mid-air, between him and the wash-hand stand. He stared at this in amazement. It was an empty bandage, a bandage properly tied, but quite empty. He would have advanced to grasp it, but a touch arrested him, and a voice spoke quite close to him.
"Kemp?"
Said Kemp with his mouth open.
"Keep your nerve. I'm an invisible man."
Kemp made no answer for a space and simply stared at the bandage. Invisible man?
"I am an invisible man."
The story he'd been active to ridicule only that morning rushed through Kemp's brain. He didn't appear to have been either very much frightened or very greatly surprised at the moment, but realization would come later. "I thought it was all a lie," he said. The thought uppermost in his mind was the reiterated arguments of the morning. "Have you got a bandage on?"
"Yes."
"Oh," said Kemp, and then roused himself. "I say, but this is nonsense. It's some trick." He stepped forward suddenly, and his hand, extended toward the bandage, met invisible fingers. He recoiled at the touch, and his color changed.
"Keep steady, Kemp, for heaven's sake. I need help. I want help. I need help badly. Stop."
The hand gripped his arm, and he struck at it.
Kemp, keep steady."
And the grip tightened. A frantic desire to free himself took possession of Kemp. The hand of the bandaged arm gripped his shoulder, and he was suddenly tripped and flung backwards upon the bed. He opened his mouth to shout, and the corner of the sheet was thrust between his teeth. The invisible man had him down grimly, but his arms were free, and he struck and tried to kick savagely.
"Listen to reason, will you?"
said the invisible man, sticking to him in spite of a pounding in the ribs.
"Good heavens, you'll madden me in a minute. Lie still, you fool."
Kemp struggled for another moment, and then finally lay still.
"If you shout, I'll smash your face."
"Oh," said the invisible man, and he relieved his mouth.
"I'm an invisible man. It's no foolishness, no magic. I really am invisible. I want your help. I don't want to hurt you, but if you behave like a frantic rustic, I must. Don't you remember me, Kemp? Griffin, University College?"
"Let me get up. I'll stop where I am, and let me sit quiet for a minute." He sat up and felt at his neck.
"I'm Griffin of the University College. I've made myself invisible. I'm just an ordinary man, a man you've known, made invisible."
"Griffin?"
"Griffin,"
answered the voice.
"I'm a younger student than you were, almost an albino, 6 feet high, broad, pink and white face, red eyes, who won the medal for chemistry."
I'm confused. My brain is rioting. What's this got to do with Griffin?"
"I am Griffin."
Kemp thought for a moment. "It's terrible, but what devilry must happen to make a man invisible?"
"It's no devilry. It's a process. Sane and, well, intelligible enough."
"It's horrible. How on earth?"
"It's horrible enough, yes, but I'm wounded and in pain and tired. Good heavens, Kemp, you're a man. Take it steady. Give me some food, something to drink. Let me sit down here."
Kemp stared at the bandage as it moved across the room, and then saw a basket chair dragged across the floor and come to rest near the bed. It creaked, and the seat was depressed the quarter of an inch or so. He rubbed his eyes and felt at his neck again. "Well, this sure beats ghosts," he said, and laughed stupidly.
"That's better. Thank heaven, you're getting sensible."
"Or silly," said Kemp, and knuckled his eyes.
"Give me some whiskey. I'm near dead."
"I didn't feel so. Where are you? If I get up, I'll run into you. There, all right, whiskey. Here, where shall I give it to you?" The chair creaked, and Kemp felt the glass drawn away from him. He let go by an effort, His instinct was all against it. It came to rest poised 20 inches above the front end of the seat of the chair, and he stared at it in infinite perplexity. This must be hypnotism. You've suggested you're invisible. Nonsense. It's frantic. Listen to me. I demonstrated conclusively this morning that invisibility... Never mind what you've demonstrated. I'm starving. The night's chilly to a man without clothes. Food? The tumbler of whiskey tilted itself. Yes. Have you a dressing gown? Kemp made some exclamation in an undertone, and he walked to a wardrobe and produced a robe of dingy scarlet. This do? It was taken from him, and it hung limp for a moment in midair, fluttered strangely, stood full and decorous, buttoning itself, and then sat down in his chair. Oh, drawers, socks, slippers would be a comfort, and food. Anything, but this is the insanest thing I've ever seen in my life. He turned out his drawers for the articles and then went downstairs to ransack his larder. He came back with some cold cutlets and bread, pulled up a light table, and placed them before his guest. Never mind knives, said his visitor, and a cutlet hung in midair with a sound of gnawing. Invisible, said Kemp, and sat down on a bedroom chair. I always like to get something about me before I eat, said the invisible man with a full mouth, eating greedily. It's a strange fancy. I suppose that wrist is all right. Trust me. Of all the strange and wonderful... Exactly. But it's odd I should blunder into your house to get my bandaging. My first stroke of luck. Anyhow, I meant to sleep in this house tonight. You must stand that. It's a filthy nuisance, my blood showing, isn't it? Quite a clot over there. Gets visible as it coagulates, you see. It's only the living tissue I've changed, and only for as long as I'm alive. I've been in the house 3 hours. But how'd you do it? Said Kemp in a tone of exasperation. Confounded the whole business. It's unreasonable from beginning to end. Quite reasonable. Perfectly reasonable, actually. He reached over and secured the whiskey bottle. Kemp stared at the devouring dressing gown, and a ray of candlelight, penetrating a torn patch in the right shoulder, made a triangle of light under the left ribs. What were those shots? How did the shooting begin? There's a real fool of a man, a sort of confederate of mine. Curse him who tried to steal my money. Well, he has done so. Is he invisible too? No. Well, can't I have some more to eat before I tell you all that? I'm still hungry. I'm in pain. You want me to tell stories? You didn't do any shooting? Not me. Some fool I'd never seen fired at random. A lot of 'em got scared. They all got scared of me. Curse 'em, I say. Oh, I want more to eat than this, Kemp. I'll see what there is to eat downstairs. There's not much, I'm afraid. After he'd finished eating and he'd made a heavy meal, the invisible man demanded a cigar. He bit the end savagely before Kemp could find a knife, and cursed when the outer leaf loosened. It was strange to see him smoking. His mouth and throat, pharynx and nares became visible as a sort of whirling smoke cast. The blessed gift of smoking, he said, and puffed vigorously. I'm lucky to have fallen upon you, Kemp. You must help me. Fancy tumbling in on you just now. I'm in a devilish scrape. I've been mad, I think. Things I've been through, but we'll do things yet, let me tell you. He helped himself to more whiskey and soda, and Kemp got up, looked about him, and fetched a glass from his spare room. It's wild, but I suppose I may drink. You haven't changed much, Kemp, these dozen years. You fair men don't. You fair men really don't. Cool and methodical after the first collapse, I must tell you. We worked together. But how'd you do all this? How'd you get like this? For heaven's sake, let me smoke in peace for a little while, then I'll begin to tell you. But the story wasn't told that night. The invisible man's wrist was growing painful, and he was feverish, exhausted. His mind came round to brood upon his chase down the hill and the struggle about the inn. He spoke in fragments of marvel and smoked faster. His voice grew angry. Kemp tried to gather what he could. "He was afraid of me. I could see that he was afraid of me," said the invisible man many times over. "He meant to give me the slip he was always casting about. What a fool I was. Cur. I should often. Where'd you get the money?" The invisible man was silent for a space. "I can't tell you that tonight." He groaned suddenly and leant forward, supporting his invisible head on invisible hands. "Kemp, I've had no sleep for near 3 days except a couple of doses of an hour or so. I gotta sleep soon." "Well, have my room. Have this room." "But how can I sleep? If I sleep, he'll get away. Oh, what's the matter?" "What's the shot wound?" "Oh, nothing. Scratch and blood. Oh, how I want to sleep." "Why not?" The invisible man appeared to be regarding Kemp. "Because I'm a particular objection to being caught by my fellow men." Kemp started. "Fool that I am," said the invisible man, striking the table smartly. "I've put the idea into your head." Anyway, folks, it's been about an hour. Before we get started in on the next chapter, I'm gonna, leave a little bit of space for you all to pause the video, go get some water, maybe get up and wander around if you've been sitting for that long. Definitely, I already said water. Maybe grab a snack if you're, got the munchies or something. But, feel free to pause the video and come back when you've gotten that all out of your system, and we'll drop back into the next chapter. Chapter 25, 6, 7, 8. No, there's only one X there, you goober. Chapter 18, The Invisible Man Sleeps. Exhausted and wounded as the invisible man was, he refused to accept Kemp's word that his freedom should be respected. He examined the 2 windows of the bedroom, drew up the blinds, and opened the sashes to confirm Kemp's statement that a retreat by them would be possible. Outside, the night was very quiet and still. Outside, the night was very quiet and still, and the new moon was setting over the down. Then he examined the keys of the bedroom and the 2 dressing-room doors to satisfy himself that these could also be made an assurance of freedom. Finally, he expressed himself satisfied and stood on the hearth-rug, and Kemp heard the sound of a yawn.
I'm sorry I cannot tell you that all I've gone through tonight, but I'm worn out. It's grotesque, no doubt. It's horrible, but believe me, Kemp, in spite of your arguments of this morning, it's quite a possible thing. I've made a discovery. I meant to keep it to myself, and, well, I can't. I need to have a partner. And you, well, we can do such things, but tomorrow. Now, Kemp, I feel as though I must sleep or perish, whichever comes first.
Kemp stood in the middle of the room, staring at the headless garment. "I suppose I must leave you. It's incredible. 3 things happening like this, overturning all my preconceptions, would make me insane, but it's real. Is there anything more that I can get you?"
Only bid me good night.
Good night, Kemp said, and shook an invisible hand. He walked sideways to the door, and suddenly the dressing gown walked quickly towards him.
"Understand me. No attempts to hamper me or capture me or..."
Kemp's face changed a little. "I thought I gave you my word." Kemp closed the door softly behind him, and the key was turned upon him forthwith. And then as he stood with an expression of passive amazement on his face, the rapid feet came to the door of the dressing-room, and that too was locked. Kemp slapped his brow with his hand. "Am I dreaming? Has the world gone mad, or have I?" He laughed and put his own hand to the locked door. "Barred out of my bedroom by a flagrant absurdity." He walked to the head of the staircase, turned, and stared at the locked doors. "It's fact." He put his fingers to his slightly bruised neck. An undeniable fact, but... He shook his head hopelessly, turned, and went downstairs. He lit the dining room lamp, got out a cigar, and began pacing the room, mumbling. Now and then he would argue with himself. Invisible? Is there such a thing as an invisible animal? In the sea, yes, thousands, millions. All the larvae, all the little napili and tornarius, and all the microscopic things, the jellyfish. In the sea there are more things invisible than visible. I never thought of that before. In the ponds, too, all those little pond life things, specks of colorless translucent jelly, but in air? No, it can't be. But after all, why not? If a man was made of glass, he would still be visible. His meditation quickly became profound. The bulk of 3 cigars had passed into the invisible or diffused as a white ash over the carpet before he spoke again, and then it was merely an exclamation. He turned aside, walked out of the room, and went into his little consulting room and lit the gas there. It was a small room because Kemp didn't live by practice, and in it were the day's newspapers. The morning's paper lay carelessly opened and thrown aside. He caught it up and turned it over and read the account of a strange story from Iping that the mariner at Port Stowe had spelt over so painfully to Mr. Marvel. Kemp read it swiftly. Wrapped up, disguised, hiding it. No one seems to have been aware of his misfortune. What the devil is his game? He dropped the paper and his eyes went seeking. He said, and caught up the St. James Gazette, lying folded up as it arrived. Now we shall get at the truth, said Dr. Kemp, and he rent the paper open. A couple of columns confronted him.
An entire village in Sussex goes mad, was the heading.
Good heavens, said Kemp, reading eagerly an incredulous account of the events in Iping of the previous afternoon that have already been described. Over the leaf, the report in the morning paper had been reprinted. He reread it. He ran through the streets, striking right and left, Jaffers insensible, Mr. Huckster in great pain, still unable to describe what he saw, painful humiliation of the vicar, women ill with terror, windows smashed, this extraordinary story, probably a fabrication, but too good not to print, cum grano. He dropped the paper and stared blankly in front of him. Probably a fabrication. He caught the paper up again and reread the whole business. But when does the tramp come in? Why the deuce was he chasing a tramp? He sat down abruptly on the surgical bench. He's not only invisible, but he's mad, positively homicidal. When dawn came to mingle its pallor with the lamplight and cigar smoke of the dining room, Kemp was still pacing up and down, trying to grasp the incredible. He was altogether too excited to sleep. His servants, descending sleepily, discovered him and were inclined to think that overstudy had worked this ill on him. He gave them extraordinary but quite explicit instructions to lay breakfast for 2 in the Belvedere study, and then to confine themselves to the basement and ground floor. Then he continued to pace the dining room until the morning's paper came. That had much to say and little to tell, rather. And then, beyond the confirmation of the evening before, and a very badly written account of another remarkable tale from Port Burdock. Sorry, I'm easily distracted, and I've gotten distracted by my headphones. They're suffering from a loose set of insulation. I'll have to fix those after the stream. My poor sweet children. Just the insulation split, thankfully. The wires are fine. Anyway, as I was saying, it had much to say and little to tell beyond the confirmation of the evening before, and a very badly written account of another remarkable tale from Port Burdock. This gave Kemp the essence of the happenings of the Jolly Cricketers, and the name of Marvel. He's made me keep with him for 24 hours, Marvel testified, and certain minor facts were added to the Iping story, notably the cutting of the village telegraph wire. but there was nothing to throw light on the connection between the Invisible Man and the tramp, for Mr. Marvel had supplied no information about the 3 books or the money with which he was lined. The incredulous tone had vanished, and a shoal of reporters and inquirers were already at work elaborating upon the matter. Kemp read every scrap of the report and sent his housemaid out to get every one of the morning papers she could, and these he also devoured. "He's invisible, and it reads like rage growing to mania. The things he may do, the things he might do. Then he's upstairs, free as the air. What on earth should I do? For instance, if it would be a breach of faith, if... No." He went to a little untidy desk in the corner and began a note, and he tore it up half-written and wrote another. He read it over and considered it, and then he took an envelope and addressed it to Colonel Ade, Port Burdock. The Invisible Man awoke even as Kemp was doing this, and he awoke in an evil temper, and Kemp, alert for every sound, heard his pattering feet rush suddenly across the bedroom overhead. And then a chair was flung over and the wash-hand stand tumbler smashed. Kemp hurried upstairs and rapped at the door eagerly. Chapter 19. Certain First Principles. "What's the matter?" asked Kemp when the Invisible Man admitted him.
"Nothing."
"But confound it, the smash!"
"Fit of temper. Forgot this arm and it's sore."
"You're rather liable to that sort of thing."
"I am."
Kemp walked across the room and picked up the fragments of broken glass. "All the facts are out about you, you know," Kemp said, standing up with the glass in his hand. "Everything that happened in Iping and down the hill. The world has become aware of its invisible citizen, but no one knows you're here." The Invisible Man swore.
The secret's out."
"The secret's out? I gather it was a secret. I don't know what your plans are, but of course I'm anxious to help you." The Invisible Man sat down on the bed. "There's breakfast upstairs," said Kemp, speaking as easily as possible, and he was delighted to find his strange guest rose willingly. Kemp led the way up to the narrow staircase, to the belvedere. "Before we can do anything else, I must understand a little more about this invisibility of yours." He sat down, after one nervous glance out of the window, with the air of a man who had talking to do. His doubts of the sanity of the entire business flashed and vanished again, as he looked across to where Griffin sat at the breakfast table, a headless, handless dressing gown, wiping unseen lips on a miraculously held serviette.
"It's simple enough and credible enough,"
said Griffin, putting the serviette aside and leaning the invisible head on the invisible hand. "Well, no doubt to you, but..."
"Well, yes, to me it seemed wonderful at first, no doubt, but now, good heavens, we'll do great things yet. I came on the stuff first at, Chesilstowe."
"Chesilstowe?"
"I went there after I left London. You know I dropped medicine and took up physics. No, well, I did. Light fascinated me, you see." "Optical density. The whole subject is a network of riddles, a network with solutions glimmering elusively through. And being but 22 and full of enthusiasm, I said I'll devote my life to this. It's worthwhile. You know what fools we are at 22.
"Fools then are fools now."
As though knowing could be any satisfaction to a man. But I went to work like a slave, and I had hardly worked and thought about the matter 6 months before light came through one of the meshes suddenly, blindingly. I found a general principle of pigments and refraction, a formula, a geometric expression, involving 4 dimensions. Fools, common men, even common mathematicians don't know anything of what some general expression may mean to the student of molecular physics. But in the books that the tramp has hidden, there are marvels, miracles of optics. But this was not a method, it was an idea that might lead to a method which would be possible without changing any other property of matter, except, in some instances, colors, to lower the refractive index of a substance, solid or liquid, to that of air, so far as all practical purposes are concerned."
"That's odd. But I don't see quite... Well, I can understand thereby you could spoil the valuable stone, but personal invisibility is a far cry."
"Precisely. But consider,
Visibility depends on the action of the visible bodies on light. Either a body absorbs light, or it reflects it and refracts it, or does all these things. If it neither reflects nor refracts nor absorbs light, it cannot of itself be visible. You see an opaque red box, for instance, because the color absorbs some of the light and reflects the rest, all the red part of the light to you. If it didn't absorb any particular part of the light, but reflected it all, then it would be a shining white box. Silver. A diamond box would neither absorb much of the light nor reflect much from the general surface, but just here and there where the surface were favorable, the light would be reflected and refracted, so that you would get a brilliant appearance of flashing reflections and translucencies. A sort of skeleton of light, if you will. A glass box wouldn't be so brilliant nor so clearly visible as a diamond box, because there's less refraction and reflection. See that? From certain points of view you could see quite clearly through it. Some kinds of glass would be more visible than others. A box of flint glass would be brighter than a box of ordinary window glass. A box of very thin common glass would be hard to see in a bad light, because it would absorb hardly any light and reflect very little. If you put a sheet of common white glass in water, still more if you put it in some denser liquid than water, it would vanish almost altogether, because light passing from water to glass is only slightly reflected, or indeed affected in any way. It's almost as invisible as a jet of coal gas or hydrogen is in air, and for precisely the same reason.
Yes, I follow. This is pretty plain sailing.
And here's another fact you know to be true. If a sheet of glass is smashed, Kemp, and beaten into a powder, it becomes much more visible while it's in the air. It becomes at last an opaque white powder. This is because the powdering multiplies the surfaces of the glass at which refraction and reflection occur. In the sheet of glass there's only two surfaces. In the powder the lights are reflected or refracted by each grain it passes through, and very little gets right through the powder. But if the white powdered glass is put into water, it forthwith vanishes. The powdered glass and water have very much the same refractive index. That is, the light undergoes very little reflection or refraction in the passing from one to the other.
You make that glass invisible by putting it into a liquid,
You make the glass invisible by putting it into a liquid of nearly the same refractive index. A transparent thing becomes invisible if it's put in any medium of almost the same refractive index, you see. And if you'll consider only a second, you'll see also that the powder of glass might be made to vanish in the air if its refractive index could be made the same as that of air. For then there would be no refraction or reflection as light passed from glass to air.
Yes, I follow, but a man's not powdered glass.
No. In fact, he's more transparent.
Nonsense.
That from a doctor. How one forgets. Have you already forgotten your physics in 10 years? Just think of all the things that are transparent and seem not to be so. Paper, for instance, is made up of transparent fibers, and it's white and opaque for only the same reason that a powder of glass is white and opaque. Oil-white paper fill up the interstices between the particles with oil, so there's no longer reflection or refraction except at the surfaces, and it becomes as transparent as glass. And not only paper, but cotton fiber, linen fiber, wool fiber, woody fiber, and bone, camp flesh, camp hair, camp nails and nerves, in fact, the whole fabric of a man, except the red of his blood and the black pigment of a hair, are all made up of transparent, colorless tissue. So little suffices to make us visible one to the other. For the most part, the fibers of a living creature are no more opaque than water. Good heavens, of course. I was thinking only last night of the sea larvae and all jellyfish. Now you have me. And after all that, I knew and had in mind a year after I left London, 6 years ago. But I kept it to myself. I had to do my work under a frightful disadvantage. Oliver, my professor, was a scientific bounder, a journalist by instinct, a thief of ideas. He was always prying. And you know the knavish system of the scientific world. I simply wouldn't publish and let him share my credit. I went on working. I got nearer and nearer, making my formula into an experiment, a reality.
I told no living soul because I meant to flash my work upon the world with crushing effect and become famous at a blow. I took up the question of pigments to fill up certain gaps, and suddenly, not by design but by accident, I made a discovery in physiology. Yes? You know the red coloring matter of blood? It can be made white, colorless, and remain with all the functions it has now. Kemp gave a cry of incredulous amazement at this, and the Invisible Man rose and began pacing the little study. You may well exclaim. I remember that night. It was late at night. In the daytime one was bothered with a gaping, silly students, and I worked then, sometimes till dawn. It came suddenly, splendid and complete in my mind. I was alone. The laboratory was still, with the tall lights burning brightly and silently. In all my great moments I've been alone. One could make an animal a tissue transparent. One could make it invisible, all except the pigments. It could be invisible, I said, suddenly realizing what it meant to be an albino with such knowledge. It was overwhelming. I left the filtering I was doing and went and stared out of the great window at the stars. I could be invisible, I repeated. To do such a thing would be to transcend magic, and I behold, unclouded by doubt, a magnificent vision of all that invisibility might mean to a man. The mystery, the power, the freedom. Drawbacks I saw none. You have only to think, and I, a shabby, poverty-struck, hemmed-in demonstrator, teaching fools in a provincial college, might suddenly become this. I ask you, Kemp, if you, anyone to tell you, would have flung himself upon that research, and I worked 3 years, and every mountain of difficulty I toiled over showed, and another from its summit, the infinite details and the exasperation. A professor, a provincial professor, always prying. When are you going to publish this work of yours? Was his everlasting question. And the students, the cramped means 3 years I had of it, and after 3 years of secrecy and exasperation, I found that to complete it was impossible. Impossible. How? Money, said the Invisible Man, and went again to stare out the window. He turned round abruptly. I robbed the old man, robbed my father. The money wasn't his, and, well, things went poorly after that. Chapter 20. At the house in Great Portland Street. For a moment Kemp sat in silence, staring at the back of a headless figure at the window, and then he started, struck by a thought, and rose, took the Invisible Man's arm, and turned him away from the outlook. You're tired, and while I sit, you walk about. Have my chair. He placed himself between Griffin and the nearest window, and for a space Griffin sat silent. Then he resumed abruptly. I had left the Dang, that's a real tongue twister of a name. I had left the Chesilstowe cottage already, when that happened. It was last December. I'd taken a room in London, and a large, unfurnished room in a big, ill-managed lodging house in a slum near Great Portland Street. The room was soon full of the appliances I'd bought with his money. The work was going on steadily, successfully, drawing near an end. It was like a man emerging from a thicket, and suddenly coming on some unmeaning tragedy. I went to bury him. My mind was still on this research, and I didn't lift a finger to save his character. I remember the funeral, the cheap hearse, the scant ceremony, the windy, frostbitten hillside, and the old college friend of his who read the service over him. A shabby bent old man with a sniveling cold. I remember walking back to the empty house, though the place had once been a village and was now patched and tinkered by jerry builders into the ugly likeness of a town. Every way the roads ran out at last into the desecrated fields and ended in rubble heaps and rank, wet reeds. I remember myself as a gaunt, dark figure going along the slippery, slimy pavement, and the strange sense of detachment I felt from the squalid respectability, the sordid
commercialism of the place. I didn't feel a bit sorry for my father. He seemed to me to be the victim of his own foolish sentimentality. The current cant required my attendance at his funeral, but it really wasn't my affair. But going along High Street, my old life came back to me for a space. I met the girl I had known 10 years since our eyes met. Something moved me to turn back and talk to her. She was a very ordinary person, mind. It was all like a dream that visited the old places. I didn't feel then I was lonely, that I'd come out from the world into a desolate place. I appreciated my loss of sympathy, but I put it down to the general inanity of things. Re-entering my room seemed like the recovery of reality. These were the things I knew and loved. There stood the apparatus, the experiments arranged and waiting. Now there was scarcely a difficulty left beyond the planning of details. I'll tell you, Cap, sooner or later all that complicated processes. We needn't go into that now. For the most part, saving certain gaps I chose to remember, they're written in cipher in those books the tramp has hidden. We must hunt him down and get those books again, but the essential phase was to place the transparent object, whose refractive index was to be lowered between two radiating centers of a sort of ethereal vibration of which I'll tell you more fully later. No, not those Röntgen vibrations. I don't know that these others of mine have been described. Yet they're obvious enough. I needed 2 little dynamos, and these I worked with a cheap gas engine. My first experiment was with a bit of white wool fabric. It was the strangest thing in the world to see it flicker in the flashes of soft and white, and then watch it fade like a wreath of smoke and vanish. I could scarcely believe I'd done it. I put my hand into the emptiness, and there was the thing, solid as ever. I felt it awkwardly and threw it on the floor. I had a little trouble finding it again, and then came a curious experience. I heard a meow behind me, and turning, saw a lean white cat, very dirty, on the cistern cover outside the window. A thought came into my head. "Everything ready for you," I said, and went to the window, opened it, and called softly. She came in, purring. The poor beast was starving. I gave her some milk. All my food was in the cupboard in the corner of the room, and after that she went smelling around the room, evidently with the idea of making herself at home. The invisible rag upset her a bit. You should have seen her spit at it. But I made her comfortable on the pillow of my trundle bed, and I gave her butter to get her to wash.
You processed her?
I processed her, yes, but giving drugs to a cat is no joke, Kemp, and the process failed.
Failed?
In 2 particulars. There were the claws and the pigment stuff. What is it, at the back of the eye in a cat? You know.
The tapetum.
Yes, the tapetum. It didn't go. After I'd given the stuff to bleach the blood and done other certain things to her, I gave the beast some opium, put her in the pillow she was sleeping on the apparatus. And after all the rest had faded and vanished, there remained 2 little ghosts of eyes.
How odd.
I can't explain it. She was bandaged and clamped, of course, so I had her safe, but she woke while she was still misty and meowed dismally. Someone who came knocking. It was an old woman from downstairs who suspected me of vivisecting. Drink-sodden old creature, with only a white cat to care for in all the world. I whipped out some chloroform, applied it, and answered the door.
Did I hear a cat? My cat?
Not here, said I very politely. She was a little doubtful, and tried to peer past me into the room. Strange enough to her, no doubt. Bare walls, uncurtained windows, truckle bed, with the gas engine vibrating and the seethe of the radiant points, and that faint ghastly stinging of chloroform in the air. She had to be satisfied at last, and went away again.
How long did it take?
3 or 4 hours, the cat. The bones and the sinews and the fat were last to go, and the tips of the colored hairs. As I say, the back part of the eye, tough iridescent stuff it is, wouldn't go at all. It was night outside long before the business was over. There was nothing to be seen but the dim eyes and the claws. I stopped the gas engine, felt forward and stroked the beast, which was still insensible, and then, being tired, left it sleeping on the invisible pillow and went to bed. I found it hard to sleep. I lay awake thinking weak, aimless stuff, going over the experiment over and over again, or dreaming feverishly of things growing misty and vanishing about me until everything, the ground I stood on, vanished, and I came to that sickly falling nightmare one gets. About 2, the cat began meowing about the room. I tried to hush it by talking to it, and then decided to turn it out. I remember the shock I had when I struck a light. There were just the round eyes shining green and nothing round them. I would have given it some more milk, but I hadn't any. It wouldn't be quiet. It just sat down and meowed at the door. I tried to catch it with an idea of putting it out the window, but it wouldn't be caught. It vanished. Then it began meowing in different parts of the room. At last I opened the window and made a bustle. I suppose it went out at last. I never saw any more of it anyway. Then, heaven knows why, I fell, thinking of my father's funeral again in the dismal, windy hillside, until the day had come. I found sleeping was hopeless, and locking my door after me, wandered out into the morning streets.
You don't mean to say there is an invisible cat at large?
Well, if it hasn't been killed, why not?
Why not? I didn't mean to interrupt.
It's very probably been killed, if I'm honest. It's alive 4 days after, I know, and down a grating in Great Titchfield Street, because I saw a crowd round the place trying to see whence the meowing came. He was silent for the better part of a minute, and then he resumed, somewhat abruptly. I remember that morning.
Sorry, this voice is a little out of my normal pitch. Even though I sing in that pitch all the time, I don't talk in it, so it's putting a little strain.
I remember that morning before the change very vividly. I must have gone up in Great Portland Street. I remember the barracks in Albany Street and the horse soldiers coming out, and at last I found the summit of Primrose Hill. It was a sunny day in January, one of those sunny, frosty days that came before the snow this year. My weary brain tried to formulate the position, to plot out a plan of action, and I was surprised to find, now that my prize within my grasp, how inconclusive its attainment seemed. As a matter of fact, I was worked out. The intense stress of nearly 4 years' continuous work left me incapable of any strength of feeling. I was apathetic and tried in vain to recover the enthusiasm of my first inquiries, the passion of discovery that had enabled me to compass even the downfall of my father's gray hairs. But nothing seemed to matter. I saw it pretty clearly that this was a transient mood due to overwork and want of sleep, and that by either drugs or rest it would be possible to recover my energies. And all I could think clearly was that the thing had to be carried through. The fixed idea still ruled me. And soon, for the money I had, I was almost exhausted. I looked about me at the hillside, with children playing and girls watching them, and tried to think of all the fantastic advantages an invisible man would have in the world. After a time I crawled home, took some food and a strong dose of strychnine, and went to sleep in my clothes on my unmade bed. Strychnine is a grand tonic, kept to keep the flabbiness out of a man.
It's the devil. It's Paleolithic in a bottle.
I woke vastly invigorated and rather irritable. You know?
I know the stuff. Sorry, I'm gonna read the rest of Griffin's monologues in my normal reading voice, or my throat will be very unhappy with me. So, if it's clearly Griffin's dialogue rather than a monologue, I'll use his voice, but no, I'm going to read normally for the rest of this section. And there was someone rapping at the door. It was my landlord with threats and inquiries, an old Polish man in a long grey coat and greasy slippers. I'd been tormenting a cat in the night, he was sure. The old woman's tongue had been busy. He insisted on knowing all about it. The laws in this country against vivisection were very severe. He might be liable. I denied the cat, and then the vibration of the little gas engine could be felt all over the house, he said. That was true, certainly. He had drowned me into the room, and he peered about over his German silver spectacles, and a sudden dread came into my mind that he might carry away something of my secret. I tried to keep between him and the concentrating apparatus I had arranged, but that really only made him more curious. What was I doing? Why was I always alone and secretive? Was it legal? Was it dangerous? I paid nothing but the usual rent. He'd always been a most respectable house in a disreputable neighborhood. Suddenly my temper gave way, and I told him to get out. He began to protest by a jabber of his right of entry, but in a moment I had him by the collar and something ripped, and he went spinning out into his own passage. I slammed and locked the door and sat down quivering. He made a fuss outside, which I disregarded, and after a time he went away. But this brought matters to a crisis. I didn't know what he would do, nor even that he had the power to do. To move to fresh apartments would have meant delay, although I barely had £20 left in the world, for the most part, in a bank. And I couldn't afford that. Vanish, it was irresistible. Then there would be an inquiry, the sacking of my room. But at the thought of a possibility of my work being exposed or interrupted at its very climax, I became very angry and active. I hurried out with my 3 books of notes, my checkbook, the tramp has them now, and directed them from the nearest post office to a house of call for letters and parcels in Great Portland Street. I tried to go out noiselessly, and coming in I found my landlord going quietly upstairs. He'd heard the door close, I suppose. You'd have laughed to see him jump aside on the landing as I came tearing after him, and he glared at me as I went by him, and made the house quiver with the slamming of my door. I heard him come shuffling up to my floor, hesitate, and go down, and I set to work my preparations forthwith. It was all done that evening and night. While I was still sitting under the sickly, drowsy influence of the drugs that decolorize blood, there came a repeated knocking at the door, but it ceased, and footsteps went away and returned, and the knocking was resumed. There was an attempt to push something under the door, a blue paper, and then in a fit of irritation I arose and went and flung the door wide open. "Now then," said I. It was my landlord, with a notice of ejectment or something. He held it out to me, and saw something odd about my hands, I expect, and lifted his eyes to his face. For a moment he gaped, then he gave some sort of inarticulate cry. He dropped a candle and writ together and went blundering down the dark passage to the stairs. I shut the door, locked it, and went to the looking-glass. And then I understood his terror. My face was white, like white stone. But it was all horrible. I hadn't expected the suffering, a night of racking anguish, sickness and fainting. I set my teeth, though my skin was presently afire, all my body afire, but I lay there like grim death. I understood now how it was the cat that howled, until I chloroformed it. Lucky it was that I lived alone and untended in my room. There were times when I sobbed and groaned and talked, but I stuck to it. I became insensible and woke languid in the darkness. The pain had passed. I thought I was killing myself. I didn't care. I shall never forget that dawn. I had the strange horror of seeing that my hands had become as clouded glass, and watching them grow clearer and thinner as the day went by, until at last I could see the sickly disorder of my room through them, though I closed my transparent eyelids. My limbs became glassy, the bones and arteries faded, vanished, and the little white nerves went last. I gritted my teeth and stayed there to the end, and at last only the dead tips of my fingernails remained, pallid and white, and the brown stain of some acid upon my fingers. I struggled up, and at first I was incapable as a swathed infant, stepping with limbs I couldn't see. I was weak and very hungry. I went and stared at nothing in my shaving glass, at nothing save where an attenuated pigment still remained behind the retina of my eyes, fainter than mist. I had to cling onto the table and press my forehead against the glass. It was only by an effort of will that I dragged myself back to the apparatus and completed the process. I slept during the forenoon, pulling the sheet over my eyes to shut out the light, and about midday I was awakened again by a knocking. My strength had returned, so I sat up and listened, and heard a whispering. I sprang to my feet, and as noiselessly as possible began to detach the connections of my apparatus, and to distribute it about the room, so as to destroy the suggestions of its arrangement. Presently the knocking renewed, and voices called, first my landlord's and then 2 others. To gain time I answered them. The invisible rag and pillow came to hand, and I opened the window and pitched them out onto the cistern cover. As the window opened, a heavy crash came at the door. Someone had charged it with the idea of smashing the lock, but the stout bolts I'd screwed in some days before stopped him. That startled me and made me angry. I began to tremble and do things hurriedly. I tossed together some loose paper, straw, packing paper, and so forth in the middle of the room, and turned on the gas. Heavy blows began to rain upon the door, but I couldn't find the matches. I beat against the wall with rage and turned down the gas again, stepped out of the window, on the cistern cover, very softly lowered the sash and sat down, secure and invisible, but quivering with anger to watch events. They split a panel I saw, and in another moment they'd broken away the staples of the bolts and stood in the open doorway. It was the landlord and his 2 stepsons, sturdy young men of 3 or 4 and 20. Behind them fluttered the old hag of a woman from downstairs. You may imagine their astonishment to find the room empty. One of the younger men rushed to the window at once, flung it up and stared out. His staring eyes and thick-lipped, bearded face came a foot from my face. But I was half-minded to hit his silly countenance. But I arrested my doubled fist, and he stared right through me. So did the others as they joined him. The old men went and peered under the bed, and then they all made a rush for the cupboard. They had to argue about it at length in Yiddish and Cockney English. They concluded I hadn't answered them, that their imagination had deceived them. A feeling of extraordinary elation took the place of my anger, as I sat outside the window and watched these 4 people. For the old lady came in, glancing suspiciously about her like a cat, trying to understand the riddle of my behavior. The old man, as far as I could understand his patois, agreed with the old lady that I was a vivisectionist, and the sons protested in garbled English that I was an electrician and appealed to the dynamos and radiators. They were all nervous about my arrival, although I found subsequently that they had bolted the front door. The old lady peered into the cupboard and under the bed, and one of the young men pushed up the register and stared up the chimney. One of my fellow lodgers, a costermonger, who stared the opposite room with a butcher, appeared on the landing, and he was called in and told incoherent things. It occurred to me that the radiators, if they fell into the hands of some acute, well-educated person, would give me away too much, and watching my opportunity, I came into the room and tilted one of the little dynamos off its fellow, on which it was standing, and smashed both apparatus. Then, while they were trying to explain the smash, I dodged out of the room and went softly downstairs. I went into one of the sitting rooms and waited until they came down, still speculating and argumentative, all a little disappointed at finding no horrors, and all a little puzzled how they stood legally towards me. And then I slipped up again with a box of matches, fired my heap of paper and rubbish, put the chairs and bedding thereby, led the gas to the affair by means of an india-rubber tube, and waving a farewell to the room, left it for the last time. "You fired the house?" "Yes, I fired the house. It was the only way to cover my trail, and no doubt it was insured. I slipped the bolts of the front door quietly and went out onto the street. I was invisible, and was only just beginning to realize the extraordinary advantage my invisibility gave me. My head was already teeming with plans of all the wild and wonderful things I now had impunity to do." Alright, folks, it's about that time. It's all the time I've got for this evening. We're going to have to find out what happens in Chapter 21 next week. Hopefully we'll finish this up next week. It looks like we only have a few chapters left. I'll actually check, for that matter. Come on, let me see the chapter list, please. It's not letting me see the chapter list. Maybe not. Anyway, we're definitely going to finish this next week. But, thanks for tuning in. Go vote on Frozen Tundra Finds, please. There should be a link in the description for this. Thanks for tuning in. This has been Paper Cuts, and I hope it didn't sting.